Right, welcome back to another motion debrief for TGS 2025. We're going to be doing the round 4 motion right now. The motion reads, this house believes that policies that may have significant environmental consequences should be subject to a veto by scientific experts. So a couple of quick clarifications about how to read this motion. I think the couple of key terms that you might have looked into is probably the concepts of how, say, significant what significant means in terms of consequences of environment, in terms of how environment is also operating. What is the threshold is something that needs to be modeled into, say, how the world framing is done, and say how you're building these policies, and the models around these policies are also something that you need to be debated upon. The burden is simply proving that when there are, say, for example, significant environmental consequences, what essentially would be subject what exactly would be the subject matter of discussions by scientific experts, and will scientific experts really be required towards keeping, say, these ideas about how these things work, and who is going to be the better decision making system in these particular aspects. So moving on towards quickly debriefing you on, say, what is coming from both sides here. From Gov, I think the fundamental idea is how ecosystems are better safeguarded by technical individuals, because ecosystems would have much more beneficial in terms of how scientists are going to approach these situations, because they have the better amount of awareness, because they have data, they have research, they have a critical understanding into how these particular ecosystems work, because how environmental systems are occurring currently, there's a lot more potential harms. So because that is the threshold that we are reaching where there significant environmental consequences are going to occur, and when significant environmental consequences aren't really countered, there's a large probability that people will have mass tune effects, which are problematic, and also other effects which are essentially problematic to begin with, is going to be something that is going to be very critical to be looked into, and critical to be delineated and discussed. So when there are ecosystems to be concerned, and in terms of concerns of the environment, there's much more likelihood that when you're having decision making systems by scientific experts where they're vetoing things which they probably think are not fair towards these environments and also not fair towards these ecosystems, there's much more probability for safeguarding these ecosystems to begin with, and there's a lot more chance that sustainable development goals and other metrics are also meant to be followed through. For example, there might be certain projects which are taken without environmental consultation for large scale government projects. For example, the Amazon highway, or the other things which lead to significant environmental concerns, because you're taking away a lot of the jungle area or other probable places and stuff. There might be a lot of concerns which occur. There might be also incentives for governments to shed upon economic policy, shed upon environmental policy, where there is a lot more probability for economic gain or other financial incentives and political incentives. So if vetoes exist for these scientific communities, I think there's a lot more problematic issues that can be addressed and done better towards how these systems operate and how these issues operate. The other thing that you can probably talk about in terms of mitigating these environmental harms is that how do climate change patterns actually going to be affected positively by these changes in how is making these decisions, and how experts are the ones who are going to be given the veto power. I think the first thing is that there might be possibility that there is a much more innovation that is going to occur towards green technologies and green systems, simply because sustainable practices are more sustained, and dirty industries might face more political backlash and political upheaval, because people who will probably be more aware about these processes and probably be kept aware about how systems are operating, which means simply that, for example, there is a veto which is done, it might have more publicity and might have more call out mechanisms that are existing for these particular instances, which might mean that environment is much more protected in those paradigms. So I think that becomes very easy for giving rise to projects which are much more environmentally conscious, but also giving rise to research which is much more environmentally sustainable to begin with, which means that there is a lot more significant benefits that are associated with these systems operating for these individuals. The other thing that you can possibly discuss within this paradigm or framework is this idea about how, say, accelerated chances are there to meet, say, climate targets, and how policymaking systems are currently not going to be proper enough to do so. Now, there are a couple of frameworks in how policy decision making operates. There can be evidence based mechanisms, there can be theoretized mechanisms in terms of how theories are going to be proposed in environmental protections and standards. When you're giving scientists the veto power, there's far more significance in terms of understanding that there would be probably a lot more preventive governance which is happening, because political systems are also going to be critical of themselves and thinking much more critically about what kind of actions and steps they are taking, because they would otherwise simply just be vetoed by environmental scientists or other scientists who are interested in these fields to begin with. And there's a large more potential for decision making to be more evidence based, which then means that evidence based decision making systems can look at economic pressures and not prioritize short term political gains and political inclinations that that parties might want to do for like pandering towards their vote bases and doing some stuff which have little to no scientific evidence or scientific value. No problem, Kishore. More than welcome. It's fine if you're leaving. Um, there's also another idea or prong that leads to like this idea of preventive governance, which means that systems can act as like a precautionary measure or precautionary principles are applying when you're trying to give scientists the power to do these vetoes and do these particular policy stops which are there. So, for example, you might not know the consequences of certain environmental actions without proper study. So, when scientists are given the veto power, there's a far more scrutiny about these policies. So harmful policies are also probably not going to occur in these particular paradigms, which means that there is a lot more probability for attempting to like prevent a lot of environmental harm and environmental costs that happen because of poor policy making and decision systems, which might become much more effective than probably cleaning up the mess that environmentally bad policy making can do. For example, if you're talking about oil spills or land degradation or completely like stockpiling garbage on land, while not like deciding prior to it how to deal with that garbage or how to like prevent these harms coming to that particular system or ecosystem. I think that is something which can be much more better in the paradigm of the gov when you're describing it as possible policy making initiatives and policy making incentives to be taken into account. The other prong is probably in policy making. There's a lot more like consumer faith and consumer regard, which is there for like public trust on these particular activities, because people often might not have faith in political leaders taking the best climate conscious decisions. And since climate has become such a real thing in the world today, and there might be a lot more like consequential problems which is happening within the paradigm, it is much more likely that public trust is on individuals who they think have expertise in these fields, right? Which simply means that people best equipped with the knowledge get to take decision making systems and have greater public confidence, probably because of their lineage and their experiences which are there in this field. Because people can have far more trust in people who have actually taken environmental decisions prior to this, but have actually studied the environment, which means that their decisions and their vetoes is something which could hold a lot more like faith in terms of the eyes of the community and how they're operating. The other idea then on the social is on the idea of how the society is operating and how the society is probably going to be benefiting from this particular stance. There's probably a lot more healthier communal spaces because I think there's a lot more like proactive stances that take in public health outcomes, which means that the overall livelihood of people or lives of people are affected positively in terms of how the environment cannot be like considerably worse off from what it could be at that point of time, and there are far more consequential harms which are prevented in terms of the environmental paradigm, and the environment is being focused upon so well in terms of how it's being framed that these vetoes would probably mean that these individuals are giving more amount of like healthier alternatives and creating systems or ecosystems where healthier probabilities are existing for people to exist within, which means that they have a lot more like easier and simpler lives, and probably things like simple issues like pollution and other things are better dealt with when policy making systems are effectuated by these individuals. Um, and of course, literacy increases about environmental concerns, and of course, long-term prosperity is also another prong that you can discuss when you're talking about the prop case. I'm just giving you the basic idea about how to approach this paradigm from prop. I'm not going too much in depth into structure, word building, and framing, and also characterization of this debate. But that more or less gives you the idea about where this debate lies for the government case. Any questions for the Gov side before we move on to a quick discussion about the op paradigm? Cool. Let's discuss the op world then. For op, the case is somewhat similar to what we were discussing for round three. I think the idea is that you do look at say democratic structures and see what kind of democratic institutions are we placing our faith in, because democratic institutions being the final layer of judgment calls means that there's a far more greater accountability that is held towards people who are actually electing them as elected leaders, because governments operate by the people, for the people, and of the people, and therefore it means that there's a lot more probability for them to be more accountable towards these systems. Then you can argue that there is probability that when environmental decision makings are concerned, instead of giving, say, probably a model about veto making, you can probably give them a model about consultancy, that large scale consultancy and mechanisms are operated where they're allowed to table environment related policies in front of the government, which can lead to quicker like decision making systems by the government in and of itself. But the government still has like other conflicting interests that they need to care about, right? Because I think a government needs to prioritize how the best amount of budget is used for the most amount of policy that can come around for these systems, but also like the government needs to have like some amount of prioritization in terms of how it can sort of like look at in terms of the way in which it's operating different ideas and different possibilities. What I mean is that citizens can have like a very clear cut impact from different systems coexisting with each other, which can mean that if you're just prioritizing the environment and not looking at other things like, for example, survivability, healthcare, and other issues, it might become like very narrow minded for these individual systems to operate within. So governance is not only just about like prioritizing certain things, it's about looking at society as a whole and prioritizing all of the interests in the society at the same time, which means that community structures are pretty well defined and well cleared out and well built upon. So I think that becomes a very primary concern which comes around from the societal perspective and the governance perspective of, say, the op paradigm. The other idea is that how innovation might become stifled, because I think in some places there might be a lot of like precursor towards not doing much, instead of like saying that a lot of things environmentally harm you. I think there's a lot more possibility for incremental growth to occur when you're allowing certain policies to pass through for the environment. So even if there's something like taking away 10% or 20% of the carbon, but instead of dealing with the entire issue, I think it's still better off than not doing anything at the present, because I think if veto powers are given to somebody, that simply means that they can completely like erode upon or completely stop certain policy or certain decisions to be made, which simply indicates that there's a larger probability for things to like become worse off in that particular paradigm when there's not like incremental innovation and things which are going to happen. What this indirectly means is that there's a stifling of innovation and growth, and necessary infrastructure projects and other projects are very necessary in terms of the scientific development of the systems, and also like systems just being present there so scientific data can be collected is also missing. So this can lead to like stifled innovation and growth for the community in terms of, say, a lack of scientific innovation or lack of like probability of action, but also like lack of like probability in terms of economic integration and stagnation, and how like other job losses can be like a predominant concern when you're looking at just sole environmental concerns and there. The other thing is that, as I was mentioning, since you have been given by like a veto power means that there's an abject amount of strength which you possess, where you can completely like denote every like policy as unacceptable if you wish to do so, and that might mean that there's a lot of negative consequences which occur, right? That there can be like economic recessions or energy shortages, or there might be some amount of democratic unrest or other problems which can be there. So there's no democratic recourse which is then left at that point of time if you're completely giving veto power to a particular institution or particular system, which might mean that there's a failure of how preventive measures can be taken in terms of economic or other political crises and other environmental harms that can come around from these systems. So when these particular like reset issues occur, there's a larger probability that these issues are not like cohabitative of, say, other decisions that need to occur within the broader community space to make like better communal systems and better judgment calls to begin with. Now, the other thing is that there is a larger propensity for public resentment, because if these people are constantly voting policy that can sort of like give jobs and give other sort of like incentives and benefits, there's a large scale likelihood that people are very disenfranchised and dissatisfied with how things are operating within those systems. And that can be also very clear cut and negative, and also very hard to approach. So that is something that will be like primary concerns toward these economic systems and these like decision making systems and bodies. So there can be an anti-expert sentiment or a public resentment which can occur for these places, and I think that is something that you have to be very careful about when you're looking at how framework of these veto motions are going to occur. There are a couple of other things in terms of the op paradigm. One on the principle of how the environment would sort of like look out. Um, you can be very dogmatic when you're looking at this narrow-mindedness towards like environmentalism. So even the most well-intentioned person who is going to like run an environmentally protectionist regime, while vetoing a lot of things, might have a lot of like problems and a lot of trade-offs that are there. You can also like be very shallow minded in terms of approaching environmental concerns. Sometimes like things which are good can also not be like completed or not be like accepted in society unless they're perfect, and this decision making system will be something which is very problematic to begin with, because again this comes back to the concept of that incremental changes and incremental benefits are something that are probably going to like miss out on these particular ideas or these particular frameworks. Now, there's also like a problem when people are looking at only say like singular policy. They don't look at broad picture scales and broad picture narratives, which might become problematic for decision making systems, as we were discussing before in other communal spaces. But not just like community spaces like budgets and recessions and fiscal policy and political instability and so on. But even when in environmental concerns, you're looking at policies individually, you don't know how incremental lots of different policies can be together. So when you're vetoing one policy and not like looking at the broader picture of things, that can also lead to like a tunnel vision effect, which might create a lot of problem for these individuals and these systems. On an individual perspective, then there is, of course, what I already discussed, economic hardship, which is probably from a lot of like different standpoints, because people will not have like a lot of like possibility to have economic mobility, because sometimes these systems or decision making systems would be something which is going against what is needed for them to do better and be better within the social space, and how they're like looking at their narratives and how they're feeling like well entwined within the narrative of the social systems. The last thing that probably could be discussed here is the disenfranchisement of people, because I think the first and foremost thing that environmental concerns have is that most amount of people taking collective action gives the best outcomes and the best results, which is something which is far more lacking in, say, a place where people are going to be given all the veto power and all the power in the world to take decisions on their own like guise and in their own like recourse, which creates a lot of harm which is possible in terms of addressing these issues. So that's more or less the case for opposition. In case there are any questions, let's just take them right now. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up for the day. Aditya, Radhika, any questions? None? Cool. Disentrenchment looks like disenfranchised individuals is what I meant. Disentrenched is different from disenfranchised. I think I mentioned both, so I'll just explain both at the same time. Disenfranchised means that, let's look at it from a vote system or a political system. When probably you do not have political rights, you feel alienated from society, which means that you do not really subscribe towards the political systems or ways in which things operate. So, on an environmental level, when you're saying you're disenfranchised from the movement or disenfranchised from the system, it could simply mean that people will feel a lot less powerful in terms of their own narratives. They might feel that their decisions are not being respected. They feel that their rights are being abrogated because there are impacts on their daily livelihoods and other issues. They don't really engage civically with these environmental concerns and don't really go ahead and subscribe towards these environmental ideas by themselves, which is why they are sort of like going on a separate tangent from systems that are there. On disentrenched, it means that there are possibilities that, again, broad level analysis is not done for environmental policies, and a lot of other policies are also like, which needs to cohabit with the environment, are also like often shunned or does not like look after. So entrenchment occurs when you possibly like barricade yourself and only protect that particular area. Disentrench means that you don't really accept anything to like enter those protected areas and you just like shun them continuously away. So that's what I sort of like meant there in that point of time. Any other questions? Can you please re-explain what opposition can say about innovation? Okay, so let's just look at it this way. Suppose I have invented something. I'm taking away 50% of carbon dioxide emissions from the car. I'm not solving the issue. I'm just doing the issue some amount of favor by doing some amount of reduction. Suppose I'm a hardcore environmentalist and I say that I really want a solution here. This is not a solution. Go ahead and find me a solution. Otherwise, I'm not going to veto this from the first time. That becomes a problem, because then that means that there's a lot less like incremental growth and reaching a stage where you can slowly and steadily go towards your goal of reaching that environmental concern. The other end is probably about how growth and innovation is stifled from other communities and other spaces. For example, if you're reprioritizing all of your resources and efforts into environment, there might be some amount of like takeaway which is there from policing, from infrastructure development, from budgets and other ideas as well. I did repeat the innovation point. Did you still not hear me, Radhika? Was that still inaudible to you? Okay. So two prongs. One about like innovation in the environmental field, where incremental growth towards dealing with environmental concerns are not probably respected as much in this paradigm. Second, on say the communal field or the aspect of how environment is not just the sole thing that we're doing in society, which means that there is a lot more budget which is taken away and resources which are taken away from other systems, where economic growth and other growth for these systems are also like not helpful for these individuals. And the other idea is that these particular systems will not have enough amount of finances, incentives, or other things which are there for other communities as well, which means that people themselves cannot grow economically, or people themselves cannot grow like socially in terms of how they are viewed and perceived and what kind of concerns they're raising in the societal level. I hope that clears it out. Any other question or any follow-ups? Hmm. All right, considering no more follow-ups, I will wrap it up here. I'm also feeling a bit disjointed. So 10:55 is when we wrap up. Thank you again for joining in for this session. We'll have the rest of the motion debriefs. I either record them, pre-record them, or I'll have another couple of sessions next week sometime. Thank you again for joining in. Have a good evening.